What we want to look at tonight is what is a Republican answer to this bloodletting? What's the answer to making it stop? What's the answer to a lasting peace in Palestine? So I'm going to go first of all to Glyn Secker to speak, and then Steve Freeman will be our second speaker. So I'm going to hand over now to Glyn.
Thank you very much. I'm going to first of all, sort of like deliver a speech by way of comments on the situation, and then expand on that with a little bit of history. And my intention is, if you like, to set the context for what might be coming next, and where significant changes in the situation in Israel-Palestine might come from, how they might arise. I think probably best to talk about possible particular solutions in the discussion afterwards. Okay. So we had 260 young Israelis gunned down at a music festival and a mass murder of members of a kibbutz. We deeply regret and mourn all these deaths. Israel is carpet bombing whole residential areas with thousands of deaths, many trapped beneath buildings and therefore uncounted, and with water, power and food supplies shut down as a weapon. And these are war crimes. Gaza's main hospital, Al-Shifa, resembles a slaughterhouse, overwhelmed with bodies everywhere and staff unable to cope. Israel leafleted North Gaza and Gaza City, telling 1 million people they had 24 hours to evacuate the area before a major attack. Such an evacuation is, of course, impossible, and this could become a genocide of historic proportions, and it will enormously amplify the hatred behind the recent attacks on Israelis. But who created this hell? Some in Jews for Justice for Palestinians, Jewish Voice for Labour, Jewish socialist groups have family in Israel. So I'd like to quote from a plus 972 magazine, which has Palestinian and Jewish Israeli journalists. They published an article recently, and this paragraph stood out for me. The dread Israelis are feeling right now is a sliver of what Palestinians have been feeling on a daily basis under the decade-long military regime in the West Bank and the Gaza siege. This 75 years of occupation needs spelling out. So there were 19 Deir Yassins in 1948, the annihilation of the villages which they wanted to clear in order to establish Israel. And that created the panic and the ethnic cleansing of 750,000 Palestinians. And then we move on, and there was the massacres of Sabra and Shatila and refugee camps, and then later of Jenin. And then there were the attacks on Gaza, summer rains, about every 4 years, these attacks. Summer rains, autumn clouds, cast lead, protective edge. Bombardments which killed nearly 4,000 people, mostly civilians and children. And then the March of Return assassinations by Israeli snipers, including medics and journalists. The annual Jerusalem Day Kristallnacht, whereby Zionists march through East Jerusalem and break windows and beat people up and smash locks and glue locks up. And it's a general intimidation. And it reminds me of what happened in 1938 in Germany in the Kristallnacht, intimidation of Jews. Over this period since 1967, you've had 60,000 home demolitions. Recently, you had the Harara and Jenin pogroms. And running behind this is a theme, the abduction of Palestinian children, often in the middle of the night, many thrown into solitary confinement with their parents not told where they were. When asked about ending the occupation, an Israeli spokesperson replied that they'd handed back Gaza and look what happened. So I think we have to invert that. If Israel had been blockaded for 17 years, with its hospitals, schools, houses, power, water, and sewage systems repeatedly bombed, or if Israel was subjected to military occupation for 56 years, with settlers setting fire to their crops and their homes and stoning children on their way to school, and if 17 peace talks from 1991 had all failed, who in the world would criticize Israel if they used force to fight for their freedom? In fact, the UK would be sending them Storm missiles as they are in Ukraine. Now, to ensure I'm not misunderstood, what Hamas fighters did were war crimes and crimes against humanity. But in 2004 and 2006, Hamas offered Israel and the United States stop hostilities in exchange for a two-state solution, with even no mention of the right of return. They were turned down and their leader, Yassin, was assassinated. Closing down of free speech, of peaceful action for change, like the right to boycott, and the right to free speech to criticize Israel and its ideology using accusations of anti-Semitism, just opens the doors to armed force. So the blood of Israelis and the blood of Palestinians will be on the hands of the Israeli state, its government, and its backers, which include the UK. So I'm reminded of slogans that were quite powerful during the Irish Troubles, quote, here in UK and Ireland. Stop the bombings, stop the killings, get the troops out, end the occupation, end the lockdown, siege of Gaza. Return human rights and freedom to the Palestinian people. That's the only way that from the river to the sea, we should all be free. So just to recap some of the history of that, it's important to realize that religious Zionism has, from its inception, early days, prior to the formation of Israel, has always had a policy of clearing the population that lived in Palestine out in order to create a Zionist state. That wasn't the case with all forms of Zionism, but it's particularly true of religious Zionism and of political Zionism. Another important date is 1994, where a settler, Barak Goldstein, attacked the Hebron Mosque, killing tens of worshippers. And that was a turning point for Hamas, which up until that point had counseled against killing civilians. And it changed its policy as a result of that occurrence. So, as I said, Hamas in 2004 and 2006 proposed a two-state solution. And that was backed by the Gulf states and Egypt, and they argued that Hamas should be given a chance to govern. When these proposals were rejected, Hamas ended its 16-month-long ceasefire. And it was then that Israel imposed the blockade in 2007. So we had the developing pressure cooker of this siege of Gaza. And just want to look at the effect that had on children. I mean, nearly half the population of Gaza are children, young people, 2.4 million people, over 1 million of them children. So children have been growing up not knowing only deaths through the whole, very close to them through the whole of their childhoods, deaths of mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, bosom friends, role models. And this experience becomes integrated into their sense of what everyday life is. It becomes their lived experience, and it's their only future. It becomes an experience which is integrated into their identity. Now, that becomes coupled with Islam in that in certain sections of Islam, if you become killed in actions to defend your mosque, you become a martyr and you go to heaven. So there's a basis there for the development of a militant Islamism, which is different to Islam. And through that process, you get the creation of militant martyrs. And that's very powerful for young people, because it then creates a whole meaning structure which answers the whole sense of hopelessness that nearly all young people face in Gaza. So what are the powers at play in this situation? Well, I often like to go back initially to look at what Israel's role is in its location in the Middle East. Historically, the ruling groups in Jewish societies played a particular social and economic function in those societies as merchants, as bankers, as moneylenders. And that was very significant across many societies in the days of pre-capitalism and early capitalism. So you had this role of being interlocutors and facilitators of the economies of those nations, playing an important role in terms of banking and finance, where often both Jews and Christians at times were forbidden to be involved, not Jews, sorry, Muslims and Christians were forbidden to be involved in usury. When the beginning of the development of the political movement that ended up with the creation of Israel began to be established, it was clear that Israel, the proponents of a Jewish state, of an Israel, were not going to make any headway unless what they're proposing was fitted in with and was of some significant utility to the international powers that existed, to the existing imperial powers of America and Europe and Britain and so on. And so the citing of Israel, there were lots of choices where a Jewish nation state could be located. But the Middle East won out because it was a very strategic position. On the one hand, and on the other hand, the story of the Bible, very powerful ideology, could be used as an argument for the Zionist movement. And that really was very successful. So Israel became an interlocutor and of very real practical use to the United States, EU and UK for securing access to oil and access to the Suez Canal. And because it needed to be armed, it grew very significantly into a military industrial complex. So then let's jump a bit, and we have now in recent times the development of Hezbollah and Hamas, and the developments of what has happened in Iran and Russia. And they are major players, obviously, in the politics in the Middle East, and America and the West are pitted against their interests. We'll come back to that in a little minute. What also, of course, is a new addition to the power play in the Middle East is that for the first time, settler religious Zionism is in the driving seat in Israel. We had so that brings us into the current political context, and we need to talk about the Abraham Accords, which were Trump's initiative. The basis of those accords was to grow economic trade and finance and development in the Middle East, to include sections of Palestinian society, particularly Palestine Authority and the ruling groups in the Palestine society, to develop trade in such a way that it would overtake or undercut all the political conflicts. And with the development of wealth, the political divisions would somehow magically evaporate. Of course, the Abraham Accords were really a way of sidestepping the whole question of freedom and human rights for the Palestinians, and would allow the continuation of their oppression, and would separate out the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia and Egypt, separate them from the Palestinian cause through being much more deeply involved in international finance and financial developments and economic developments. So one of the things that has been talked about as a purpose lying behind this latest Hamas attack has been the disruption of the Abraham Accords. Now, whether that was their intention or not, of course, we don't know. But what it has done is provoke such a response from Israel, and thereby such a response of support, expressions of support by the populations of the Arab states and the populations of Egypt, actually across North Africa, that it has caused the Arab Accords to be put on hold, meetings cancelled. Okay, just another jump forward. How was it that Hamas were able to make such an impact? Well, the IDF all along had an assumption which that Hamas had too much to lose because of its economic base and aspects of its financial privilege in Gaza to risk a full-scale attack on Israel. And that meant that the IDF shifted its focus to the West Bank settlers. And obviously the recent election of extremist settlers into them, producing them as members of the cabinet, added to that arrangement, if you like, that perspective. And it meant that the IDF took their eyes off the ball, and in terms of what was going on in Gaza. And then you could say, well, what were the timings? Well, there were internal divisions in Israel, of course, with the conflicts around Netanyahu's government and the reducing of the powers, the independence of the Supreme Court, and so on. And also, the attack actually happened on a big Jewish holiday, Simchat Torah, which whole communities are engaged in. But the Hamas fighters, there's some stories coming out that they might possibly have been caught by surprise, and that what they might have expected was a direct confrontation with the IDF, and they were prepared to be killed, but expected to make a significant impact. But actually, they found themselves with no opposition from the IDF, and with this open access to civilians, probably with no plan. And matters then just took off. Now, the scale of the Israeli response, which is Netanyahu's fight for his own credibility, plus the fascist far right in the government, is producing an attack on Gaza, which is of Guernica type intensity, but actually on the scale of Hiroshima. The United States has sent the Sixth Fleet to deter Hezbollah and Iran from getting involved. Because, of course, if Hezbollah really seriously opens up another front in northern Israel, in Lebanon, Israel will be overstretched. Hezbollah last time round, when they had a confrontation with Israeli forces, actually gave them a severe thrashing. Okay, and Hezbollah is far more better armed and organized than it was then. I suppose so too is the IDF in theory. But it would draw in America, and that would draw in Iran, and then we could have a whole new situation on our hands. And yet, so we have the negotiations taking place between the Americans and everybody, including Hamas proxy through Egypt. But Netanyahu seems to have left himself with no choice. He's told the world he's going to invade with a massive ground invasion. And Hamas have said they won't stand by and watch. Whether they will invade or not remains to be seen. But what is possibly a development from all this is that we might be in a moment when tectonic plates shift. I've always said, when anyone has asked me, what do you think will bring about a change in Israel-Palestine situation? Would it be, the furtherance of a two-state solution? Has that gone? Is the world now behind a one-state demand? And is there enough pressure behind that through the United Nations and through members of the Security Council to really effect some change? Or would some Swiss canton formula actually make a lot of sense and make it possible? And I've always said all these proposals, often some of them worked out in very intelligent detail, are all in many respects academic, because the whole thing sits on the vested interest of America and Europe and Israel's utility to them in that. And until Israel becomes counterproductive for American interests, nothing much will change. Well, now we have a situation where Israel might actually be becoming counterproductive to American interests, because America does not want a third war in the Middle East. It does not want any more body bags coming home to America. And it would create a massive financial dislocation internationally. In a way, it could be worse than the effects of the Ukrainian conflict. Certainly as bad, if not worse. And the international financial structures are really quite insecure at the moment. And so everyone wants to return to business as normal. So that's, of course, what the Americans are negotiating for. But events don't often just fall out neatly like that. And there may well be an opportunity. How it arises, I have no idea. But sometimes things happen very quickly that no one predicts. And there might just be a possibility here. But I don't know. Meanwhile, we continue to express our solidarity with the Palestinian people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Glyn. That was fascinating, a fascinating history and a fascinating idea of a possible outcome. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to bring Steve Freeman in now to talk to us. Steve.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Carol. And thank you, Glyn. And I'm not going to repeat what Glyn has said, obviously, because what I want to say is kind of, I think, complementary to it, but taking us in a different sort of direction. And I think, my first point probably would be, of course, we as I was out with other comrades on Saturday opposing this war in Gaza, we can take that as a given, and we can take those points that Glyn made about this war. But I want to raise the question of what is, from a Republican perspective, what would be a peace and justice solution we need to have. And it might seem, as you say, a little bit perhaps abstract, a little bit theoretical. But I think at a time when war's going on and we want to oppose that war, we want to oppose the bombing and shelling of Gaza, we want to oppose the invasion and occupation, the cutting off of food supplies, water, electricity, and also the repression that is going on in the West Bank. I noticed that 58 people were killed in the West Bank and 500 people were arrested, as it were, incommunicado. So we're opposing that, but I think we have to try to think what perspective do we want to put on the question of peace? Because there's more to peace than simply saying stop fighting. That's not really the answer to it all. So that's what I wanted to do, to address this question of what strategy should the left have, and I think there needs to be a debate, a wider discussion on the left. And what we want to do is to bring a Republican perspective into this discussion and see where it leads us, and hopefully to have a discussion with other comrades. Now, I thought what I would do, Carol, if I could, is I will just do a screen share first of all, just do a couple of points so you can kind of see what I'm going to be saying in a couple of screenshots. Okay, this was the first thing I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about Republicanism and peace, and just to give you a kind of rough measure of where I am, but it's not quite going to be the same. This is what Yanis Varoufakis said very recently. He said, apartheid must be smashed and a two-state solution is nearly impossible. And he said, and we've got in brackets, even if desirable for a number of reasons. So I'm going to speculate what that means is even if desirable for a number of reasons. And then he goes on to say the only realistic, civilized solution is for a single secular state for all with equal civil liberties independently of religion and ethnicity. And so what I'm going to say is not quite the same as that, but quite close to it. And so that will be the things that I want to concentrate on in my points. And I've just got one more slide to show you, which is just the structure of what I'm going to just talk about. And I've got this one. I'm going to argue that we should be making a case that the longer term solution is for a democratic, secular Federal Republic of Israel and Palestine. Now, so the points I want to make, or the discussion I think we should have, is first of all about peace. And I want to contrast what is the difference between an imperialist version of peace and a Republican version of peace. And then I want to address the question of one state. That's one state or two states, because that's lurking behind it. Then I want to mention the idea of two nations, because I think we have two nations, however they may be. Then I want to address the question of secularism or secular republic and ethno-religious republics. And then say something about self-determination and federalism, which is also. And I suppose my argument in brackets here is that there is an element of two states in the story, but it is about becoming one state. So it's somewhere between, because in a sense, I would want to argue that Palestine should have self-determination, should become a state, but not as an end in itself, not as a solution, because I think one state is no longer a solution, but as becoming part of a federal republic. And I'm doing this because I hope that we can engage with other people on the left to see what they're saying. And I'll be very interested to see what comrades have to say about that. So if I could then just go, I can leave that screen share, I think, at this point. We don't have another one to do. So you can see the things I'm going to address. I wanted, first of all, just very briefly, to contrast different roads to peace. And one of them, I thought, well, I'll just go back to 1917, 1918 very briefly. Remember that in 1918, there was a Versailles Treaty, a treaty passed with Germany at the end of the First World War. And I would call that an imperialist peace, a peace that was imposed upon Germany. And people afterwards say this peace system, and part of that, of course, was what happened to the Ottoman Empire, so it links into this story directly. It was an imperialist peace. It was about carving up the Middle East. It was about securing something for Germany. And I would call that an imperialist peace opposed from above on people, which ended up being a disastrous failure. And we're still living there for that. And I'll contrast it with what happened in Russia in 1917, because you had a popular opposition, a popular peace movement that wanted peace, land and bread. And how it got that, there was a movement coming from below by the people who then overthrew the Tsarist government in February 1917 and carried on the struggle even after that, because peace wasn't secure by that act of establishing a republic, because the provisional government wanted to carry on with the war. They used peace words, but their real policy was to carry on. And so that Republican idea went further later on in the year and established a form of democratic republic, etc. Now, I take that as a Republican peace and an imperialist peace. One is coming from above and the other one is coming from below. So my first point is we as workers, socialists, traders, we're looking for a peace between people. We're not expecting America or Britain or any of the imperialist powers to come up with a peace. And if we talked about the two-state solution, I think that's an example of an imperialist peace that simply has not worked and maybe was never going to work. And we can discuss that. So I think that what we're really talking about as Republicans is we're talking about a democratic solution coming from the people themselves, supported by the people. And I was thinking that, our peace is not a kind of peace claimed by the Netanyahu government, that is pacification by mass killings and ethnic cleansing, the peace of the graveyard. Our answer to the continual cycle of violence, hatred, and revenge is to find a just and lasting peace supported by the majority of Israelis and Palestinians. And in one sense, like the Irish peace process, a democratic Republican peace would have to have the endorsement of the people of Israel and Palestine in a referenda. I believe that would be in a referendum. I think that's the way to think about it, as it got the support of the people. Now, we can discuss whether the possibilities of that. So that's what I want to begin as conduit. So I want to work on the idea not of the two-state solution coming from above, but from below. I wanted to make a point about one state. First of all, that was my first point. And I think I want to talk about an economic argument for one state. Today, Israel has 77% of the territory of what was formerly British mandated Palestine, a territory similar to the size of Wales. And the remaining part of that territory is divided between the West Bank and Gaza. The population of Israel is 9.2, is 3.1 million in West Bank, with 500,000 settlers, another 2.3 million, 2.4 million in Gaza. So that's 5.4 living under occupied territories. And I want to say that from an economic perspective, a big state is better than a small state. You know, it's no surprise that a bigger state works better than a small state. That's why America's done well. That's why China's doing well. That's why India's going to do well in the future. So a state of 15 million people will be more economically viable than two states of 9.4 and 5.4 million people. That's simply a logic of capitalist accumulation and capitalist development. But what we've got there, of course, the World Bank report tells us that the Palestinian economy operates well below its potential, and it's very much subordinated in its interest to, and I think similar to, but not the same as, but similar to the South African Bantustans. 150,000 Palestinians work in Israel. And Israel is giving them work permits. Last year, there was going to be an increase in 20,000 in work permits for West Bank workers. And there was going to be extra work permits going to Gaza, up to 14,000 work permits. And so Israel places massive burdens on the economies of the West Bank and Gaza. I mean, Israel collects the Palestinian taxes and customs and then routinely withholds them. Unemployment is 24%. 22% of its labor force works in Israel, and hence half of the working class from the West Bank is not adding any wealth or value creation directly in its local market, either because it's unemployed or because it's working in Israel. The Gaza's economy is completely controlled by Israel. Building materials, energy, food, drugs, chemicals, clean water can be switched on and off. Poverty rates are 80%, and 50% of people are unemployed. And so what you have is a kind of depressed economy of like people living in a permanent state of austerity, low growth, economic stagnation. So the idea that this area should be broken up into three areas, and that one state should control those three areas is obviously something wrong. It makes a lot more economic sense to think the best solution would be to have one economic system working freely without all the barriers, without all the work permits, so that people could move freely around them. So I think there's an economic case for one state. That's not a political case for it, by the way, just an economic case. It would make more sense for all of the people living there to have an economy where people could move freely around. Okay, so let's make a second point, because of course there are two, I would argue there are two nations, and of course nations are social and ideological constructs. They're invented, but they're real enough because they reflect and shape people's collective identity. It seems to me that Israel as a nation, it takes a while to create. Israel wasn't created just because it declared itself to exist in 1948. So it has to take a period of time for a culture, an idea, and an identity to develop. So you might say that Israel becomes a nation over the next 20 to 30 years. Till you get to a point where most people are actually born in Israel. They're not immigrants coming from elsewhere. They're born in Israel. They live in Israel. Even though that state was, as we know, was created by Zionism, coming out of this combination of British imperialism, Zionism, and the Holocaust. I think what I would say about it is that this Israeli nation has been created by Zionism, and that's the major problem of it. That I do think I'll say this, that a non-Zionist Israel is possible in the same way that a white South Africa can be replaced by a democratic South Africa. So I don't think Israel has to be Zionist. And I think you have to remember that 80% of Israelis are Jews and 20% of them are Arabs. And I'd like to call it the 80-20 nation. There's a tendency to think that Israel is a Jewish nation. No, it isn't. It's a mixed nation of 80-20 Arabs and Jews. I think the Palestinian nation has been created later than that in response to Zionism. But I didn't realize until recently that in this earlier stage, it was Arab nationalism that drove the opposition to Israel. It was Nasser, it was Pan-Arabism. It wasn't really a Palestinian idea. That came a little bit later, probably in the 1970s and 80s, with the creation of the PLO. So, one state's the best solution. There are two nations. And I think the next point I'd briefly want to make is I'll speed up a little bit. I want to make a point about republicanism, because we sometimes think in England that republicanism is all about having not having an unelected monarchy. But republicanism is very much about democracy, about freedom, about equality, and having a secular state. It's about people working together collectively, about citizens cooperating with each other. And that is a universal idea. So as Republicans, we are totally opposed to any ethno-religious republics. We're opposed to a Jewish republic of Israel. We'd be opposed to an Islamic republic of Iran, a Hindu republic in India, etc. Because by definition, these kinds of ethno-religious republics make all non-believers and other religions into second-class citizens. So whilst I think Israel is a nation that now exists, it doesn't have to exist as an ethnic-based Jewish republic. So I think there is, of course, in Israel, probably even maybe a majority of Jews in Israel are secular, not religious. So I think there is a basis for an argument for having a secular Republic of Israel and a secular Palestine. So just going on, I think to probably my last point, which is about federalism from below and self-determination, and I'll end there. Federalism. The question is, can these two nations, Israel and Palestine, become one republic from the river to the sea? And I don't mean by that a greater Israel, and I don't mean by that a greater Palestine. So I'm going to want to use an analogy that we use as far as the idea of in respect to England, Scotland and Wales. We're in favour of England and Scotland and Wales becoming a federal republic. But such a federal republic should not be imposed upon England, but imposed by England, on Wales and Scotland. So we take the view that Wales and Scotland must become sovereign, independent nations so that they can freely and voluntarily become part of a federal republic. And this is the idea of self-determination. Even if we achieved a federal republic, of course, every nation would have to have the democratic freedom to leave. And what that means is that in this sense, there couldn't be a democratic, secular federal republic of Israel and Palestine unless Palestine secured its own independent position as a state. There needs to be a Palestinian state. There needs to be an end of the occupation in order to get to the idea that one could move towards the idea of one state, a federal, democratic, secular Republic of Israel and Palestine. So the final point, I think, is this is something that has to come from the people. This is something that has to come from below. it's in opposition to the imperialist and Zionist plan of the so-called two-state solution. But it recognizes that if we're going to get to peace, the Palestinians must have the right to decide for themselves to become a sovereign state so that they can become part of a federal state, which I believe economically would be advantageous to all the people living in that area, not least the working class, because I think it would enable the working class to organize themselves together across one state. So I'll finish at that point there. I know this seems a bit abstract and theoretical, you'll probably say, in the face of what's happened, but Glyn has told us about that. And I think that when there's a war going on, we have to talk about stopping the war, but we also have to have an idea of what could be a plan for peace. 2 states, 1 state, self-determination, and all those things that I wanted. So I've come to a point which is quite similar to the Varoufakis resolution, a Varoufakis statement at the beginning, and I'll finish there. I'm looking forward to hearing what comrades have to say.
Thank you very much, Steve. We've already got 2 hands up, so and I'm sure there'll be many more that want to contribute. There's quite a few very interesting comments in the chat already. So I would actually encourage those people who've put comments in the chat, questions in the chat, to please raise your hand so that we can bring you in and you can ask your question and make a contribution. So the first hand up was Malcolm. I'm going to go straight to Malcolm.
There's 3 points really. One is about the Zionist state. It's the point made in Tony Greenstein's book, where he points out, or I don't know if it's him, but he points out that the Nazis were slightly sympathetic to the Zionist ideals because the Zionists wanted to create a racially purist state. I mean, that's what they wanted to do. And obviously racially doesn't make much sense. That's the first point about what is the Zionist state. Secondly, nobody's spoken about the 5 million Palestinians in the 68 camps that exist, and I don't know what either of the speakers think those people might do. And the third point is, and I'm quite happy to be corrected on this, I think Hamas is part of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the sort of organization that's been in existence in the Islamic world since the early 30s. And their ambition, as far as I know, is to create a giant Islamic state which stretches from Spain to Indonesia. So I have no idea what the people in the Palestinian camps think about Islamic states or secular states or anything, because I can't find out about that. And so I'd just be interested in what either of the speakers would have to say about those 3 points. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. Very pertinent questions. I've got Mike and then Jenny. I'm going to bring, and Ken. I'm going to bring them all in, and then I'll give over to Steve and Glyn to answer questions.
All right. Yeah, I'm not going to make any sort of major points, but I just wanted clarification on 1 or 2 points of detail, which relate, I guess, most particularly to sort of Glyn's introduction. As we noticed on the London demonstration, and as I had some experience of before, not all Orthodox Jews are Zionists, and some are rabidly anti-Zionist. And we witnessed one such guy demonstrating with everybody else, waving a placard, standing on top of a bus shelter and being cheered by the crowd for doing so. So it is not just that the religious Zionists are all Orthodox Jews. That clearly it's more complicated than that, though I don't quite understand how. And, you know, disentangling this is important in terms of whatever shifts may be possible within the complex which is Israeli society at the moment, for it to have any possibility of transitioning into the kind of state which is open in the way that Steve suggests. Another question. There have been rumors that I've seen on the internet that the Wagner Group, Russia's Wagner Group, led by Prigozhin R.I.P., have been involved in training Hamas. And I just wondered whether this is just rumor or whether there is any truth to it. There is a wider point, though, in terms of the balance of forces in the Middle of East and beyond. I mean, there was a warning. I read a warning last night by the boss of JP Morgan Chase, the big American bank, suggesting that the reverberations of this war for international capitalism are going to put the consequences of the Ukraine war in the shade, and it's going to be, a very significant, have a very significant impact on world markets generally, and on the capacity of to being able to carry on as business as usual. But is it likely to be the case, given that there is the hard right Republicans seem to be calling the shots in the American House of Congress, and they obviously are very, very, very ultra pro giving maximum support to Israel and the complete obliteration of Gaza if they could. They at the same time are wanting to withdraw support to a greater or lesser extent from the war in Ukraine and from backing Ukraine. So one of the losers out of all of this is likely to be the Ukrainian state, certainly Zelensky and co. And, that's likely to shift a whole range of possibilities there with regard to what Putin may or may not be able to achieve. So I just wondered if somebody could tie some of those elements together, because it's by no means easy and by no means simple.
Thank you very much, Mike. Also, very good questions. I'm going to bring Jenny in now.
Right. My sort of contribution is a bit more sort of parochial and local, really, and that is in terms of the ability to support Gaza. Recently, I've been looking around. I live in Spain, and I was looking around for any protests that could be made in support of Gaza, and what protests there were, and they're not many, are very small. A few dozen in Malaga, about 300 somewhere up in Barcelona. It's all very low key, very badly publicized. But so for me, to actually try and, sitting where I am, to try and get involved in ways of keeping the pressure up, it's proving difficult. Similarly, in the UK, we have the awful situation where even the Labour Party now are trying to crush any show of any support for Gaza, and actually threatening Labour Party members with being reported or investigated for merely holding the bloody flag of Gaza and various other bits and pieces. And I think it's really important that we continue to keep the pressure up and the visibility of it up. And I was interested to be able to view the video of Gerald Kaufman's speech in 2009 when Gaza was attacked. And it was an excellent speech, which would not be possible now for somebody in the Labour Party to do without the threat of expulsion. And it just shows how far we've come, where the possible new prime minister will be Keir Starmer, and he has just failed to recognise anything from Gaza's point of view and merely says that we must support Israel unequivocally. And then I began to think about the situation for Netanyahu, and I began to wonder, what exactly is he going to do? Because he is currently protected from prosecution at the moment because of his political status. It makes him immune. And there's a lot of anger in Israel about the lack of support and the lack of attention paid to protect Israeli citizens, because it was all looking eastward towards the West Bank to pile all the resources into the settler colonialism there. So if Netanyahu decides that because of that he needs to invade Gaza, how does he's in a bit of a cleft stick at the moment, because then he could be accused of war crimes and all the rest of it. But if he doesn't, then he has a problem with his own electorate. And I think that's a bit of an issue. And it's possibly why the tanks are still sitting on the edge of Gaza rather than going in. I don't know enough about that. But so I suppose my questions were, and what I'd like to explore is what can we do, not being in Israel, not being in Gaza, but needing to put the pressure on for the rightful solution, given the kind of forces that are in operation worldwide now, I'd say. So, yeah.
Carol, could we take these questions before we take any more? Because it's quite a lot.
Absolutely, yes. Yes, Glyn. Yes, thanks very much, Jenny. Also some brilliant points as well. Right, I'm going to bring Glyn in now. I'd also, if I may, can I just read out, because Jill can't, she's unable to ask her question personally, but she says, what about the question of having right of return for the Palestinian diaspora and the question of reclaiming land and compensation, which I think is obviously, is a really good point as well. So I just want to throw that put that into the mix as well. So yes, please, Jen, please, would you like to answer those questions?
Is that me now?
Yes.
Okay. I just like to make one observation first about Steve's point about Palestinians and work permits. I'm sure it's just a slip of the tongue, but Israel doesn't give work permits to Palestinians. They have to buy them. They cost between $590 and $740 a month. And the average wage of migrant Palestinian workers in Israel is $1,332. So these work permits are an enormous slice out of their money. But yes, you're right. Palestinian workers actually produce a huge proportion of Israel's GDP, actually, particularly in the construction industries. About the way in which they're shackled and so on means that they don't have the industrial power that you would expect to flow from that economic significance. So that it's all very much bound up with the nature of the occupation and the lack of freedom and so on. And Steve raised the point about a greater republic from the river to the sea. Of course, the issue that we need to add on to that is who controls the armed forces and the forces of the state in that situation. Otherwise, you would have an incredibly unequal situation, and it would deteriorate back to probably where we are. And as you say, that republic change would need to come from below, and then we're back to, if you like, a chicken and egg situation, because to come from below, there needs to be enough civil rights for people to express their demands, or enough physical armed force to insist that their demands are catered for. And that's, if you like, in the box that we're still in now. And it begs the question of all of us, how to get out of that box. Hamas has close, just go to another question, or point that someone made. Sorry, I haven't got the names down against the people who made the points, apologies. Hamas initially was a section of the Muslim Brotherhood, a sort of welfare section. And then it grew into a political party and an organization. And it's not under the Muslim Brotherhood, but of course it has working relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood. It's interesting that what Hamas put forward, the proposals of a two-state solution, that was just simply that, a proposal of a two-state solution. And there was no stipulation that the Palestinian side of that two-state solution would be an Islamic state. So they were suggesting a secular solution, if you like, to the problem. Okay, one might be quite cynical about that. Say, well, once they got the two-state solution, then they would expect to be in the government of the Palestinian side and control the nature of that solution. Just to row back a little bit on that, when Hamas won the Palestinian elections, it won them both in the West Bank and in Gaza. Now, the West Bank is far less Islamic, if you like, than Gaza. And they won that election on basic demands for social reform and for an end to corruption and for good governance and so on. And it would be quite a big step up for Hamas to, if it were to displace the Palestine Authority, which it did in the elections, and then the Palestine Authority, with the support of America and Israel, just wrested control back from them, which they were unable to do in Gaza, and that's how they became the government in Gaza. It would be a big step up to turn Palestinian society into an Islamic state. But it's always there as it's a good point to raise, because it's always there as an agenda, I suppose. The question of the 5 million people in the diaspora, no one, none of the Palestinian parties have been calling for to include the Palestinian international diaspora into elections for parties and for possible solutions and so on. So that's a fascinating potential. Quite how it could be organized and by whom. I mean, in a way, it would have to be organized by the United Nations for it to be effective. But it would be very interesting if some straw polls were taken and so on. Yeah, of course, not all Jews are Zionists by any means. And also there are different forms of Zionism, and not all Zionists believe in the form of ideology, political Zionism, which is the ideology of Israel at the moment. And certainly not all Jews are Orthodox. I'm part of a group of quite a wide group, I think, of secular Jews, and so again, it would be really interesting to try to get some expression of the political interests of secular Jews. No, actually, if you just started with all the Jewish communities, particularly in America, where there are more Jews in America than there are in Israel, of course, you would find that, for example, opinion polls in America come out with opinion polls of Jewish Americans that 40% of young Jews, that is Jews under 40, no, not 30%, not 40%, I think it's just under 40%, about 38% of Jews under 40 believe that Israel now is an apartheid state. That's an incredible shift of opinion that's taken place. So, I mean, involving the Jewish diaspora would be very interesting indeed. Again, how that would be performed, I don't have any idea. And that raised the question of how would you get such a shift in Israeli politics to move things on? And I tend to think that it might come out in the long term of the current situation in Israel. If the current political formation in Israel sustains, so that you have Netanyahu coupled with the extreme settlers, and removing some of the civil rights in Israel, like demoting the Supreme Court's authority. That's already, those beginnings of those policies have already led to very significant shifts of capital investment and investment decisions on the part of large corporations away from Israel. And so you would get, you could imagine a scenario where you've got the diminution of Israeli economic power coupled with a growing hostility internationally to their politics and their treatment of Palestinians. And that could, maybe, we're crystal ball gazing here, but you could imagine a social crisis developing, a social political crisis developing in Israel, where a whole new initiative would develop, maybe on the backs of just about half the population in Israel who were demonstrating on the streets and opposing Netanyahu, although they all wanted to go back to business as normal, and very few were actually linking up with Palestinians in the issue of ending the occupation. But it was becoming a bigger agenda, a more significant agenda, the issue of the occupation. Wagner and Hamas? No, I doubt it. If Hamas want training, they'll get it from Hezbollah. I don't think they would mess with Wagner, although there is a political alignment between Russia and Iran, and but I'm not sure. I would think that they would be a little bit too canny to be involved with the Wagner group. Russia's role, they have been quietly, they've stepped back from the whole thing, kept out of it, but quietly supporting the Palestinian position and Iran in this. And that's important because they're getting a lot of arms from Iran for their issues in Ukraine. they're fighting in Ukraine. I think, given what's happening in Ukraine and the effects on Russia of that, the likelihood of Russia getting involved in this dispute, in this conflict, are very low indeed. They've got enough on their plate. And the Labour Party, what's happened in the Labour Party is extraordinary. I've just seen, finally, someone's got through Starmer's bonehead, and he's finally come out with a statement saying that Israel should restore water supplies to Gaza. The way he's positioned himself is unbelievable. And I don't know where that's going to take him in terms of voters and in terms of the main trade unions who are still, whether we like it or not, are still working with Starmer. But he has isolated himself from, I think, a huge swathe of public opinion, because a large part of public opinion in this country, a little less than 50%, something like 43% or 45%, I think, are but largely sympathetic to the human rights of Palestinians. What can we do? I'll skip a few points. Maybe Steve will cover the ones I've missed. What can we do? Well, I think that what really resonates with the public is always the issue of human rights, because they are unanswerable, and the violation of Palestinian human rights are so gross that defense of those actions is not possible. They're indefensible. And so the more we focus on human rights and get local communities, local electorates, putting pressure on their MPs, putting pressure through their unions, putting pressure through their local authorities to always back the principle of human rights, that cuts through a knife, like a knife, through the whole issue, and has a powerful impact on the Israeli lobby. One of the things you might have noticed is the Board of Deputies has been extraordinarily silent through this whole period, whereas they were very vocal through the period of the Labour Party and Ken Livingstone and Jeremy Corbyn and the issues of anti-Semitism. But at the moment, they're very quiet, and that's because I think they're in a difficult position in terms of human rights. A large number of people in Jewish communities say human rights are central to Jewish values. Well, you would think they were, but there's some problems with that. And finally, to the right of return, I think it's really important not to let that slip into the background, because it raises the question of what happened in the Nakba, with the demolition of villages, the expulsion of 750,000, and the expropriation of Palestinians throughout the whole of Palestine by Israel. But it's not an easy question, because immediately the Israeli response is, well, where are you going to throw us out of all our houses? And so, because a lot of those houses were taken from Palestinians. Okay, a lot of it is all new build and doesn't fall into that category. And so you would have to come to some very powerful negotiations about how the right of return would be organized. And that comes back to the whole question of how do you get into a situation where those negotiations can even start? And that takes us back to, well, what are going to be the political opportunities in the economic and political crisis we're in now? Thanks.
Thanks very much, Glyn. I've actually got a lot of hands up. So, Steve, do you want
I'm
to?
going to forego. I'm listening. I want these other comrades to come in, so I'm going to forego my little go. I might make a couple of points at the very end because I did have some answers, some points I wanted to make from the questions that came up. But I think I can see the comrades all in a line there, looking patient, and I think they need to have their say. So I'll stand down and I'll maybe reserve my right to say anything at the very end. Okay.
Thanks very much, Steve. Seeing as we've got so many hands up, which is excellent, but can I ask comrades to keep their contributions down to 2 minutes to give everyone a chance to come in? So I'm going to bring Ken Syme, bring him in order. Ken.
Thank you, Carolyn, and thank you, Glyn and Steve. Question for Glyn, really. One country you haven't mentioned is Syria, and while you might well argue that Syria have their own problems at present and are not in a position to intervene, the Israelis seem to be rather worried about Syria. They've now bombed, allegedly, 3 Syrian airfields. So they seem to have at the back of their minds a fear that Syria might intervene on behalf of the Palestinians. Again, as you've said, Russia too has its own problems and might get a little nervous if the Syrians started to involve themselves. But I would appreciate any comments you might have on that point. Unfortunately, I agree with you that nothing is likely to change while it remains in America's interests to maintain the status quo in Israel. So I think I can't see a solution to this at the moment, unfortunately, but your views on Syria would be appreciated. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ken, and for being so brief. And a very good question. Tim, I'm bringing, Tom, bringing Tom in now.
Thanks, Carol. 2 minutes. I could do with about 15, actually, but I'll try to stick to 2 minutes. I'm going to have to be very selective. The first point I want to make is that our priority, in my opinion, should be to stop the coming attempted genocide and Nakba, which is taking place, which is envisaged to take place in Gaza at the moment, and then after that, the West Bank. So we should be really talking about how we can build the Palestine solidarity movement in this country and the anti-war movement, rather than talk about the future. I mean, the future is important, but that's not a priority. Okay, having said that, I have some disagreements with Glyn. I have many more agreements with the comments he made in response to various questions we had, which I'm pretty much in agreement. I want to take up the question of condemning Hamas. I'm a member of Merseyside Pensions Association, as well as Liverpool Friends of Palestine. And on Wednesday, we had a meeting, and Ken Loach was talking to us on Zoom, and I was actually quite shocked to hear him condemn Hamas. I'm not surprised that Glyn has said the same thing. I just want to point out that I've been watching Al Jazeera. I refuse to watch BBC, which is 24 hours a day. I'm reading numerous articles from Palestinians, and you will struggle to find a single Palestinian who condemn Hamas. On the Not the Andrew Marsh show on Sunday, Ghada Karma described them as a Palestine resistance movement. I agree entirely with that definition. To immediately rush in to condemn them in terms of the attack on Israel a week ago seems to me to be too easily following the narrative of the Western media, particularly given the sort of fake news that's come out about babies beheaded, the rape of women, all of which is fake news. It's worth pointing out that on Haaretz, interviewed an Israeli woman in her 40s who'd survived one of the attacks on the kibbutz. And what she said was many of the deaths of the Israelis there were caused by the Israeli army in a firefight where the Israeli soldiers were indiscriminately firing on the kibbutz, and she was quite sure that, well, it's no shaking your head, Russell. She said, if you want to disagree with her, you weren't there. She said clearly that she was quite sure that some of those civilians Israeli civilians, including potential hostages, were actually killed as a result of the firefight. The second she said that, if you were there, you can come out and say so, but you weren't.
Tom, you now have 3 minutes, so I'm going to have to cut you short. Could you please?
Okay, I'll just finish on this one. And secondly, what she said, this is in contrast, of course, to the dominant narrative about Palestinians being human animals, is that she said she was very well treated by the Palestinian soldiers who were there. And a final point is that the Hamas leader has actually made comments, you believe it or not, if you're willing to believe without thinking the narrative in Western media, then you should consider what he said, that the Hamas soldiers were told not to harm civilians, but their target was Israeli soldiers.
Thank you very much, Tom. I also heard reports from Israeli women about how polite actually they were and how they were not threatened. I'm just bringing Phil Villander in now.
Thanks very much. I'm not going to comment on the last speaker regarding Hamas because I don't know who murdered definitely who died at that festival, that rave, but they do appear to have died. Now, how they died, if they weren't murdered in the way that the MSM are saying, we need to know more evidence about exactly what happened. So I'm holding fire on that. As regards the Labour Party, I think it fell to Crispin Blunt, not the left of the Labour Party in Parliament anyway, to draw attention to the fact that Rishi Sunak was in danger of violating human rights. Crispin Blunt, as you probably all know, is the chair of the Institute for Palestinian Rights, and he made it clear that, in his view, you are equally culpable if you endorse the violation of the Geneva Conventions and the Charter on Human Rights as anyone who is actually doing it. In other words, those people who are backing Israel's bombing of Gaza volubly are as culpable because they are endorsing it, they're giving it their support. Now, what's interesting is that there has been a rowing back of that. We've seen that there's been a scrambling to try and say, well, look, can you be a little bit more like social workers in Gaza? You know, if you could just bomb and avoid the children, that would be very helpful, because it's rather embarrassing that you've managed to murder yet another 700, 800 children in this last 48 hours or 72 hours. So the Labour Party have their leader, who's a very highly esteemed lawyer, who came out initially with the same line as Sunak and has been fooled on it, shall we say, by Crispin Blunt, a Tory, which is interesting. So I haven't received the email, but a colleague of mine has, which says that from David Evans, that we are not to debate Palestine and Israel in our branches at the moment. That's absolutely not allowed, at the pain of being referred to some obscure body or other. However, the demonstrations were so impressive on Saturday that I think it's very hard for them to deny that there is no all-out weird. Despite the Channel 4 description from the unchallenged description from the Israeli spokesman for Netanyahu, that there were 150,000 people on the street endorsing Hamas, quotes Hamas terrorism. That doesn't seem to be the opinion of a lot of people in the party, thank goodness. So even amongst the Jewish communities in this country, people can disaggregate the tactics of the Hamas from the mass of Palestinians. Now, my last point would be, I'm intrigued about the fact that there's a thinking that Iran would automatically join in this were there to be a multilateral conflict in the sense of borders.
Phil, because we are 3 minutes now. Could you draw to a close?
I'm coming to my last point. Because Iran is waiting for $6.5 billion to be delivered as part of a deal done previously if they've been warned by Blinken, the American Foreign Secretary, that if that happens, Secretary of State, that if that happens, that money won't be coming if they come in on the war. And there was a lot of trouble with the Iran government over the rebellion, over the killing of that young woman not so long ago. And I think that it's possible they might find getting involved in a war in Israel might destabilize their government. That is a view that many hold. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Very good points as well. I'm going to bring Russell in now.
Thanks, Carol. I wasn't going to speak to this point, but I feel that it's important. I wanted to speak more about some of the proposed solutions that Steve mentioned, but I think it's important to say that sadly, the more vociferous advocates for Palestinian solidarity seem to be peddling a kind of revisionism as to what transpired in the Hamas attack on Israel. You only have to look at the images that Hamas is putting out to somehow look for excuses for such depravity, violence, and cruelty descends to the level of the oppressors that Hamas is fighting against. Cruelty, that sort of violence and cruelty needs to be condemned, both the Israeli violence and cruelty against settlers and the violence and cruelty that's being visited on Gazans at the moment, but also the violence and cruelty that's perpetrated against defenseless civilians. And it could be argued that Hamas, in a way, discredited the Palestinian cause, because it's one thing to deliver a defeat against the organized military might of your oppressors, i.e. the Israeli army, which is what Hamas did to, but it also provided the excuse to the Israelis to visit a terrible revenge on the Palestinian people. It gives the Israeli street, not the military, the Israeli street, civilians who are who are, what's the word, looking for this sort of revenge. And all those who are opposed to the Palestinians say, well, look at what Hamas did. Is this what Israel can negotiate with? So, you know, I think we should, as socialists, driven by some kind of universal concern, humanitarian concern, we should be equally condemnatory of both the violence of Hamas and the violence of the Israelis. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Russell. I'm going to bring in Harry and then John. Harry.
Yeah, you know, I think this is it's a very unprecedented period we're in here, because we're witnessing the full horrors of what's going on in Gaza. I mean, very much on the mainstream media. I mean, these things in the past were always covered up. We're seeing the footage of Gaza City in rubble. We're seeing the hospitals of the Bloods and the huge devastation what's going on there. It's reported in the mainstream media. 6,000 missiles up to last Thursday, even reported by the Israel Defense Force. The Washington Post a few days ago reported about the white phosphorus that was used against Palestinians getting access out of the country. What's going on here? This was always covered up. The Iraqi war, the atrocities, we never saw any of this. It was only after the war did we realize what was really going on, but we've never really saw the devastation that's taking place. And it's right across. You see, when you look at what the Nazis did in all their atrocities, it was backed up by defending the fatherland. That was the essence of it. And all the atrocities down the line was, you know, they found reasons, excuses, whatever you want to call them. Everything had to be excused. This is right. Oh, the Jewish people are the problems. They were the communists. They were not friends of our country. We have a right to exterminate them. And what we're witnessing now is that there's no cover up. They're telling the people what they're doing. They believe that this is justified. This is a moral right for what Israel can do, is doing now on the people of Palestine. Now, of course, they've got the mindset of what happened a week ago. It was Hamas that started it. It's the same as Biden started the Ukrainian war. We got the same a lot of coverage that's going on in Ukraine. You see, internationally now, this is what we're up against. And it's not just the Netanyahu's, the Bidens and people like that. Keir Starmer defended the right to cut off food, fuel, oil, and so on from the Palestinian people. He defended that right. That's the mindset that these people are in, and right across the globe. Take a look at the weekend and you see the opposition. You see a totally different moral values with all these protests that are taking place internationally. They're utterly different moral values and approaches to these settlements that's taking place across the globe. And that's why these protests now are the essence. I think we're way, way beyond Gaza and the situation in Israel. This is international, what this mindset is, including the opposition parties. And I haven't got time maybe to mention about the internal things about the single state, Carl, but I'm just saying that's the establishment of capitalism today. This is where the people are today, and we saw that at the weekend. Thank you, Carl.
Thank you very much, Harry. I've got John Tumman. John, I'm bringing you in now.
Thank you very much, Carol. I enjoyed Glyn's point about Hamas winning the elections in the West Bank, and that doesn't surprise me. I just need to click this unmute myself, even though I have done it.
Oh, you have. We can hear you fine.
Yeah. And I think that's a really important point, and it reminded me of a couple of things. One is a really good book on the which I read some time ago now, which was about North Africa and Egypt and the role played in those countries by the Muslim Brotherhood, which is what I want to talk about. Where effectively, because the state was not providing social welfare, the Muslim Brotherhood took on all of those roles. It was organizing civil society, organizing and building social housing where the state didn't build it, completely unofficially, without authorization. Introducing welfare systems on the ground and so on. And it did that across North Africa and in some other parts of the Middle East. The second thing is that a friend of mine, a young friend of mine, a Bangladeshi guy, he produced this as his MA thesis. Notions of democracy in the Muslim Brotherhood. And he goes through the theology of a couple of major ideologues of the Muslim Brotherhood and talks about how they discussed democracy. And So it does not at all surprise me to hear what Glyn said about Hamas and their involvement in social welfare infrastructure in Gaza, and in taking that kind of manifesto to the West Bank and actually convincing the population in terms of from the ground up support. That is precisely how it is built. And as far as atrocity stories go in a military and paramilitary conflict or war situation, frankly, I take a very cynical view of this, because most atrocity stories unravel by the end of that conflict. And when historians look back at them, they were a pack of lies. Atrocity stories have been going on since the First World War, about some of the unspeakable things that German soldiers were supposed to have done in Belgium. It was a load of crap. So anyway, those are my points, mostly about the Muslim Brotherhood.
Thank you very much, John. But I think if you just look at the name of the organization, Muslim Brotherhood, I think democracy, as far as they're concerned, it can't, if it doesn't stretch to women as well, then we really can't call it democracy, can we? Anyway, I'm going to bring in John. So our last hand up is John Fitzgerald.
Yeah, good evening, everybody. Yeah, and thanks, Glyn and Steve, for some very interesting information. I saw on the Labour list today that the Labour Party sent the emails to the constituency parties saying that they would advise them, any member, not to go on these demonstrations, strongly advised. And they also sent the emails to the leaders of the Labour Party councils saying that in no circumstances you are allowed to support any of these demonstrations or go on the demonstrations. Which really does sound to me like a dictator. This is, of course, David Evans, the NEC.
John, we're losing you a little bit. We're losing your audio.
Oh, sorry.
If you guess.
Is that okay?
That's better, yes. Yeah.
Right, okay. Yes, and coming on to Hamas, I'd like a little clarification here, because what Glyn said about the Abraham Accords, he said that was a Trump initiative. Well, what's been going on in the last 6 months is the talks between, the realignment talks, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Egypt, Palestinian Authority, and others. It didn't include Hamas in those discussions, so that could very well have been one of the triggers for their actions, although I believe there are quite a lot. I mean, the oppression of the last, since this new government's got in Israel, the oppression in both the North Gaza and the West Bank has increased dramatically. And of course, their decision to actually put a lot more settlements in the West Bank, or allow a lot more settlements in the West Bank, certainly didn't help matters. So in my view, the little I've read about Hamas, in my view, they're not IS, they're not Al Qaeda. I think, you can have discussions with them. They have been they are relevant, whether we like it or not. We may
John,
not
you
like
have
their
3
tactics.
minutes now.
Oh,
John, you've had 3 minutes. Could you
right, yeah, there we are. So yeah, I think more or less that's really kind of what I wanted to say. Yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, John. Right, I'm going to go back to Glyn and Steve to pick up those questions and points and contributions. So Steve and Glyn, if I can find Glyn.
Yeah, thank you, Carol. Again, I'm going to try to be brief, and I won't be able to answer all of the comments, but I have listened to many good points, most of which I agree with, generally speaking, from what comrades have said. But I want to emphasize a couple of things. First of all, I don't equate Nazism with Zionism, but there is something in their ideologies. If you believe in an ethnic or religious republic, then you must become supremacist eventually, I think, and that's really where what's happened in Israel has gone in that direction. Clearly, the Nazis had an Aryan supremacism as well, so there is some interconnection, but you've got to be careful how you, in my opinion, put them together. And I think Glyn said, there are lots of kinds of Zionism, and maybe in the 1940s it was different and so on. So you've got to look at it as evolving as well. But it's evolved from being a kind of more left-wing thing into something which is quite clearly has become very right-wing in the last 20 or 30 years. But anyway, another point I wanted to make just about somebody mentioned the Orthodox Jews that we saw on the demonstration. I don't remember the name of this particular religious grouping. Somebody will tell me about that.
The Torah
participating.
The Torah Party.
Yeah. So the interesting thing about them is, to me, is that they're almost secular. Now, what I mean by that is, they don't believe in a Jewish state. They think that a Jewish state is a kind of anathema. It's a blasphemy almost. So they would live in a state that wasn't Jewish as long as they could practice their Jewish religion as they see, and that's what secularism is about. Secularism is not atheism. Secularism is about the freedom for everybody to practice their religion and nobody to have a superior religion to be imposed upon anybody else to incorporate that into the state. And that's why when we're speaking about secularism in the course of this, okay, when you're speaking about secularism is a big thing. It's not just a marginal thing. In Israel, there is a conflict between, if you like, secular Jews and more Orthodox religious Jews. And that's what we've seen in this crisis of democracy in Israel, where you've had hundreds of thousands of people out on the street. And I think that has been a division within Israel between Orthodox and secular Israelis, ignoring the Palestinian question, but they can't ignore it now because they're connected together. So I do think that if there's ever going to be anything coming out of this better than it is, that movement in Israel, it's the one that put Netanyahu under pressure, is still where change from within Israel has to come back. I'm glad you raised the right of return. I don't have an answer to that, but it obviously is a hole in my position. I'm going to have to go away and think about how we fit that in. It's a complicated question, and it is a hole in my argument. And of course, I didn't know you had to pay for your work permit. It was ignorance, actually, Glyn, rather than a mistake on my part. I didn't know that, but that's also very interesting. I'll end on this point then. Tom Bipson said, and I think I want to say this: the present is in the future, and the future is in the present, and they're bound up together. And if we want to have a future peace, if we have an idea of a peace in the future, then it has to work in the present. And we have to be able to argue for it now and for it to make sense. And it's no point talking about peace if you can't think how a future direction should go. So although it might seem a bit abstract to be talking about a federal, democratic, secular republic, I think it's a discussion that has to go place. And we have to discuss the question, one state or two. Do we recognize Israel and Palestine as nations? Can we conceive of Israel as an anti-Zionist Israel, and Israel isn't Zionist in the future. It is not tied to the idea of the ideology, the particular ideology of Zionism. And secularism, can that be a force for change in this area? And then my final point was federalism and self-determination, I think, has got something to play in this story. And self-determination means that Palestinians must have the free right to choose what they want to do. There needs to be an independent Palestine, independent from the occupation, so they can freely choose if they want to go into a broader one-state solution with the rest of Israel. So I think secularism, federalism, recognizing you can have a nation, it doesn't have to be, the Israeli nation, 80-20, 20% Arabs, it doesn't have to be defined as a Jewish supremacist nation. And that's why I think some Israelis might come to that conclusion. I hope they will. And I'm sure Israeli Arabs are already not thinking that they want to be in a supremacist state, which was the original promise of Israel originally before the 2018 Jewish nation law, I think it was called.
Ken asked about Syria. Well, by and large, Israel is very thankful for Assad in Syria. Basically, he eradicated the Arab Spring, which would have made an enormous difference to the Middle East had it been successful. He eradicated it in Syria, but it was very significant, and that defeat, and that would have had, if they'd been successful in overthrowing Assad, that would have had huge reverberations across the immediate Middle East, in Lebanon and Jordan and Egypt, countries on Israel's borders. It would have been capable of really some earthquake-sized changes. So Israel is very happy to have a good relationship with Assad. On the other hand, Assad is not in complete control of his territory because Hezbollah are there. And the recent bombing of the airports by Israel was because they wanted to destroy the runways sufficiently to prevent any armed airplanes being delivered to Hamas, being bought by Hamas or whatever. Okay, we'll come to Tom. Yeah, Tom, you're absolutely right that we should be focusing on the genocides and building PSC. On the PSC platform, I don't know if you were on the demonstration on Saturday, but just about every speaker condemned the attack on civilians by the Hamas fighters, and then went on to spell out, as I hope at least I intended to spell out, that of course there's a difference between those fighting oppression and the overweening powers of those exercising the oppression. And it means you point up the enormous hypocrisy of Israel and the Israeli lobby suddenly talking about the deaths of civilians when they're civilians in Israel, but of course saying nothing about, for example, the 4,000 civilians who were killed in all their previous bombing raids on Gaza. Not all of them were civilians, about 80% of them were civilians. And all the other deaths of civilians that have occurred through this incredibly brutal occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and particularly Gaza. There was a general who boasted quite a long time ago now that after they put Gaza under siege, no one died in Gaza of old age. In other words, they all died either of food shortages or medical inadequacies, absence of treatment, early deaths because of illnesses and diseases and so on. Israel's never talked about those deaths. So we come on to the important point that you made about condemning Hamas. Well, one point is that if you're going to criticize Israel for violations of international law, for war crimes and crimes against humanity, those are legislative measures that establish human rights. Now, human rights are not divisible. You can't have some human rights and not others. Everyone, by virtue of being human, is entitled to human rights. And so you have to raise the question of the violation of human rights wherever they occur. But on the other hand, Gada Kami is quite right. The Hamas at the moment is the liberation movement of the Palestinian people. That doesn't mean that you can't criticize Hamas. In fact, there's a well-established socialist principle, unconditional but critical support. So you give unconditional support to the liberation struggle, but you reserve the right to be critical on moral grounds, on tactical grounds, on political grounds, or whatever. And that is really important, because if you don't retain those two dimensions of your intervention, then you weaken your position. And I can't remember which speaker it was, but someone said most of these atrocities turn out to be fake news. Unfortunately, they don't all turn out to be fake news. And I would be surprised if the murders of the young people in the music festival were all conducted by somebody else and not by Hamas. I'm quite prepared to be proved wrong on that. But I think the balance of probabilities at the moment is that they were the result of the Hamas incursion. But that doesn't stop you being critical of them. You can't wish them away. I don't think you can redefine them as fake news. You are critical of them, but you also say what I have tried to do, which is to say, if a country has been, if a people have been under the hammer, under the cosh for 75 years, under an extremely brutal occupation for 57 years, what do people expect them to do when all efforts at negotiated settlements fail and are designed to fail? And, you know, Oslo Accords, which were perhaps the most optimistic, people were most optimistic about, had in them, in the fine print, the expropriation of water and resources from the Palestinians, so that actually they could never create a viable state, which could then later come back to be fully recognized. They were a stitch up from the start. And okay, most people didn't find about that until later. But though you say, what do you expect to happen? You are creating this dehumanization of people. You are creating a youth who grow up only knowing death as part of their lives, right from the start of their lives. They've known nothing else. What do you expect to develop? But that doesn't mean you don't criticize it, because you want to maintain your principle of human rights, because that must be the foundation upon which all socialists want to build a socialist society. Yeah, I like the bit about, so another question, Phil, about politicians being held legally liable. And I just read tonight that someone has served notice on Starmer, I think it's the Palestinian legal organization, can't remember the name for a minute, has served notice on the Labour leadership that they are going to be served notice in terms of violating international law by supporting these Tory policy, echoing the Tories in supporting the Israeli policies on deprivation of water and so on. I think I've sort of addressed Russell's point about the balance of condemnations and so on. And John, the first John, we had 3 Johns who came back. Your point about why have we been reading about these phosphorus bombs and the atrocities that are going on? That's an important point, because we have to see this development as the move by the far right across Europe. I mean, we have a far right government here, ironically led by 2 black Asian people of far right politics. And they have actually stolen the agenda from Britain First and all the rest of them. They're left without a voice because the Tories have stolen it. But if you look at the move of the far right, apart from the elections in Poland, which were just announced this evening, where the right-wing government has been displaced by a more social democratic government, which is fantastic news. But if you look at the advance of the far right across the whole of Europe, it's really frightening. And that is the context in which the first John you were talking, and I agree with you, it's what's going on. Yeah, the Muslim, second John, role of the Muslim Brotherhood, they have always occupied that role of providing social support for people, social programs alongside their religious provisions. And they in Gaza, they sort of step back from taking the political lead, which is how Hamas were left with a window in which they grew. The Labour Party had attacking left-wing members and forbidding them to. There were none of the left-wing MPs, Diane Abbott or Bell, or any of them on the platform where you normally expect them to. Only Jeremy had already had the whip removed, was able to speak on the platform. None of the others did. But Jess Barnard spoke. Now, she's the leader of Young Labour. And not only did she speak well, but she laid into Starmer. Really brilliant, which does mean that there must be a sufficient platform, organisation within Young Labour that Starmer is frightened of, because he needs the young vote in next year's elections, and he's frightened of, pulling her membership of the Labour Party away. And we come to the last bit about the Abraham Accords. Yeah, it was Trump who set them up, but everyone seems since him has followed them. So Biden took them up, and they were structured, of course, to keep out Hamas and all the progressive movements, and to sit on top in terms of the macro international finances and so on, which of course Trump is deeply involved in. So yeah, look, thanks from my perspective, a really good meeting. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Glyn, and thank you very much.
Same from me. Can I add the same? I'm
just going to bring Steve. I'm just going to bring you in, Steve. Okay.
I'm not going to add any more. I'm not going to add any more points now because we had a long meeting. But just thank everybody for coming. Just to say that we will be producing it as a position paper to have a discussion with the Education Forum to get more feedback, and I hope that we can circulate those points about a Republican perspective on peace and get further comments and have a discussion later on. So I hope we'll be able to follow it up. Okay.
When you do that, Steve,
yes,
if you could make sure you get in my if you include Tom's point, which was important, get in my answer in terms of unconditional but critical support for Hamas in terms of
Okay. Well, hopefully we can consult, when we've got this paper, which a particular paper is discussing the future aspect of it, but this discussion about Hamas, which you addressed and I never did, but which you addressed. So that's a discussion that is going on. That is one of the things everybody's finding difficult to work around in various ways. Tony addressed it the other night. But I hope when we've got a paper, Glyn, we can send a paper to you on the future peace plan or whatever. Then I hope we might be able to comment on it too.
Yeah, great.
Well, thank you very much. Thank both of you very much indeed. Glyn, I think your answers to the questions were really spot on and extremely well done, extremely detailed answers. So thank you so much for those. And also, of course, to the people who contributed and asked those questions. We've had some fantastic contributions from the floor as well today. So I just want to thank Glyn and Steve, and to everybody who's stuck with us. We've still got 20 people after 2 hours, over 2 hours on Zoom. So I think that's magnificent. So thank you both very much indeed, and to everyone who's attended, and for this absolutely excellent discussion. Thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Goodbye.
Bye.